My name is Iris, and I'm 28 years old. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, where the vibrant arts scene made me feel like I could blend in with the creative crowd. But even in a city that prides itself on individuality, I always stood out, sometimes for all the wrong reasons. My skin is pale, and half of my face is covered with a dark, swirling birthmark that stretches from my forehead to my jaw. It's one of those things people can't help but notice, and I learned early on that I had to carry it with pride, even when others didn't seem to see it the same way. Over the years, I tried to ignore the stares, the quiet whispers, the uncomfortable silence when I entered a room full of strangers. But deep down, I knew I was different, and that difference made me a target for judgment. I had worked my way up the ranks in a high-end tech company, one where appearances often mattered more than the work itself. I wasn't naive enough to think that my looks didn't impact the way people saw me. I had spent years proving myself with code, with systems, and with ideas, but none of that ever seemed to matter to my colleagues as much as the way I looked standing in front of a client. That morning, I had prepared for the meeting as I always did, my sharpest suit, my notes perfectly organised, and my strategy in place. I was used to walking into these rooms, to the cold, calculated expectations of corporate life, but today, something felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting for me to fail. The conference room was already full, the senior executives sitting in their usual places, and as I walked in, I could feel their eyes on me. I tried to focus on the task ahead, to stay calm, but it wasn't just their gaze that made my heart race. It was the underlying judgment that I could feel without a word being spoken. I was used to it, but it never made it easier to endure. I sat down, opened my laptop, and glanced around the table. I could see it in their eyes, the skepticism, the doubt. It was as though they couldn't get past my appearance long enough to see the value in what I brought to the table. They were all dressed in dark suits, their polished shoes tapping lightly on the floor as they awaited my presentation. But I wasn't there to just present. I was there to change things, to show them that the work I had put in was more important than the way I looked. Still, as the first few minutes of the meeting went by, I could sense the tension growing. I could feel the subtle shift, the way the conversation began to revolve more around the surface-level details, around how I presented myself rather than the actual content of what I was saying. My mind kept coming back to the thought that had been lingering ever since I walked in. I didn't fit the mould. My appearance, my skin, my birthmark, they were all unusual in this world of polished suits and perfectly manicured images. I had learned to live with that, to work around it, to be so good at what I did that they had no choice but to take me seriously. But today, as I looked around the room, I realised that even though I had earned my place, they still saw me as a novelty. The woman with the unusual look, the one who didn't quite belong. And then, it came. The words I had heard in various forms over the years, the words that never quite lost their sting. "You're just not what we expect for a client-facing role," one of the senior managers said, his voice smooth but sharp. "Your look might be a bit much for some of our more traditional clients." I felt it hit me like a physical blow. The words stung, not because they were new, but because of the way they said it, the way it implied that I wasn't good enough simply because of my appearance. I forced myself to keep my expression neutral, to not let them see how deeply their words had affected me. I couldn't afford to show weakness. I had fought for too long to be seen as more than my looks, to be valued for my intellect, my skills, my ability to make a difference. But hearing it from them, hearing it so plainly, felt like everything I had worked for was suddenly unravelling. The room felt colder, their eyes more intense, and I knew that just like that, I had been dismissed. Again. I sat there, letting their judgment wash over me, trying to remain calm. But inside, I was seething. I had put everything into this company. I had sacrificed time, energy, and a part of myself to prove that I was just as capable as anyone else at that table. Yet they couldn't see it. They saw the face I wore, the face they deemed unpleasant for clients, and it made them forget everything else I had done. I felt my hands tremble slightly, but I forced them to stay still on the table. This wasn't the end. It wasn't the moment I would shrink back and accept their judgment. No. This time, things would be different. This time, they would see what I was really capable of. I didn't need to fit their mold. I didn't need to play by their rules. I would remind them that I was the one in control. And just as that thought solidified in my mind, I made my decision. The server would be turned off. Let them see what happened then. Let them realize just how much power I truly held. The words hung in the air, each syllable lingering like a weight that was impossible to shake off. Your look might be a bit much for some of our more traditional clients. They were meant to be gentle, but they cut through me like a knife. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel my breath quicken as the room seemed to close in around me. I had heard this before. In fact, I had spent years hearing versions of it. Not the right look for this role. Clients won't trust you with that appearance. The words all sounded the same, but this time they felt different. This time they felt like the final blow, like all the hard work I had put in, all the late nights, all the sacrifices meant nothing in the face of my skin, my tattoos, my hair. I was no longer seen as a person. I was just a face, a thing that didn't belong. The room had gone quiet. The others were looking at me now, some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled discomfort. I could feel their eyes on me, their judgment, hanging heavy in the space between us. But it wasn't just their gaze that I could feel, it was their silent agreement. They all thought the same thing. I didn't fit, I didn't belong, and that was all that mattered to them. I had been dismissed. The weight of that thought crushed me more than I wanted to admit. I had worked so hard to prove myself. I had fought, to show that I was more than just my appearance, that I could hold my own, that my skills and my knowledge were what mattered. But none of that seemed to matter now. Not in this moment. Not when the very core of my identity had been reduced to a look that made people uncomfortable. My hands were shaking. I could feel the sting of tears behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. No, I had to stay strong, to keep my composure, to remain calm. I forced a small smile, though it felt as hollow as the space around me. I had to play this game. I had to keep pretending like everything was fine, like their words hadn't cut straight through me. The moment dragged on, but I could feel my thoughts racing. They were all thinking it. They were all wondering if I would be able to pull off the presentation, if I could handle the big clients with the face I had. I could already hear the whispers in my mind, the way they'd talk about me after this meeting, how they'd laugh at my unusual appearance, how they'd use it as an excuse to keep me in the background, to keep me from ever truly advancing. I wasn't just being judged for my abilities, for my mind or my work. I was being judged for something that wasn't in my control, something I could never change. And that thought made my chest tighten. I had always tried to be the one who worked hardest, the one who stayed late, the one who made the impossible happen, but none of that seemed to matter when it came down to a simple glance, a glance that said everything I had done wasn't enough. That moment of judgment felt like it would swallow me whole. The silence was unbearable. I could hear the distant hum of the office outside the room, the usual sounds of emails being typed, phones ringing, people talking. But inside, in that room, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat and the voice in my head telling me that I wasn't enough. That I never would be, not as long as I looked the way I did. I could feel the anger rising inside me, but I pushed it down. Anger wouldn't solve anything. I had to stay focused. I had to get through this. So I nodded, pretending like I was fine, pretending like it didn't sting. I pushed everything down deep, where it couldn't reach the surface. And yet, despite everything, despite the humiliation, despite the sting of their words, I knew something. I knew that I didn't need their approval. I didn't need them to see me as they wanted to. I had always known what I was capable of. They hadn't seen it yet, but I would make them see. It wouldn't be today, and it wouldn't be in this meeting. But one day they would know. They would know that I was more than they could ever understand. And that thought gave me a little bit of strength. Just a little. The meeting continued, but I was no longer fully present. My mind was already elsewhere, already planning, already preparing for the moment when I would no longer need to pretend. I would show them. I would show all of them. The moment stretched out before me, and for a fleeting second I considered just walking away. Let them think I was weak. Let them dismiss me and keep me in my place. Maybe I didn't need to fight anymore. Maybe I could just let them have their way. Stay quiet. Keep doing the work behind the scenes and never rock the boat. But that thought didn't last long. I felt the fire inside me ignite again, the frustration, the anger, the years of being overlooked, and I realised that I was done. I wasn't going to keep playing this game, hiding in the shadows, pretending to be invisible just so I could keep my job. I was done with being the one who had to prove herself every single day, done with them thinking my appearance was the only thing that defined me. I had worked too hard to be where I was. I had earned my place, even if they couldn't see it. The quiet decision settled into me like a weight I could no longer ignore. I wasn't going to wait for their approval. I wasn't going to beg for their recognition. No, if they wanted to see my worth, they would have to come to me. They would have to understand that I held the power to change everything. The room was still, the sound of their voices fading into the background, as I let my mind drift to the systems that ran the company, the ones that only I knew how to control. They were so focused on my face, on the things that didn't matter, that they had no idea what was truly in my hands. I could feel the server humming softly in the distance, its cool, constant presence a reminder of just how much I could shift in the company with a single decision. And in that moment, I made the decision. I would show them. Not by words, not by pleading, but by doing something they would never expect, something that would make them see just how much they needed me. I slowly stood up from the table, trying to keep my composure, even though my hands were shaking slightly with anticipation. They were still talking, unaware of the shift that had just occurred, but I was done waiting for them to notice me. I wasn't going to beg for their validation any longer. I turned toward the door, my steps measured, purposeful. As I walked, the sound of my shoes on the hard floor was louder than usual, a reminder that this was no longer a silent battle. I was making my move. I wasn't running away. I wasn't hiding. I was taking control. My fingers moved with precision as I accessed the company's systems, knowing exactly what I was doing. It was a simple thing, an act of turning off the server. But in that moment it felt monumental. The company depended on it, relied on it, and no one knew it better than I did. And just like that, I pressed the button. The server went silent. The room went quiet, and I could almost feel the ripple of panic spreading from the executive team, even though they didn't yet know what had happened. The lights on their computers dimmed. The presentations stopped. The buzz of the office ceased. They had no idea what had just occurred, but I did. I could already hear the panic starting to creep in, the uncertainty settling over their faces as they tried to figure out why everything had come to a halt. They had taken me for granted. They had dismissed me. But now they had to face the consequences. And they would. I didn't need to say anything. I didn't need to explain. All I had to do was wait. I stayed standing by the server controls, taking a moment to let everything settle. They would come to me soon enough, scrambling. To figure out what had happened, and when they did, I would be ready. I knew the systems. I knew the ins and outs. And most importantly, I knew that without me, they were helpless. The idea of turning everything back on seemed almost trivial now. But it wasn't about that. It wasn't just about fixing the problem. It was about making them realize just how much they needed me. I had given them every opportunity to see my worth, to see me as more than just a face with a birthmark. But they hadn't listened. Now they would. I could feel the power shift. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't have to be. The quiet hum of the systems, the stillness that filled the room, was all I needed to make my point. They would see that I was the one in control. They would see that I was the one who had always been running things behind the scenes. And when they came to me, when they realized what had just happened, I would show them just how much power I truly had. I stood still for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. The server had gone quiet, the hum of the company's systems suddenly absent. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but I knew exactly what was happening. In the span of seconds, the company's carefully orchestrated rhythm had come to a screeching halt. It wasn't just the technical systems that had stopped, it was the entire facade they had built up, the illusion of control, the idea that they were in charge. They didn't know yet, but they would soon. The panic would rise like a tidal wave, and it would hit them hard. Their carefully constructed reality would begin to crumble, and all of it would be because of a simple decision I had made. A quiet decision, one that no one had seen coming. As I stood there, still and steady, I felt the power that came from knowing how much influence I truly held. They didn't know it, but their entire business was at my fingertips. I could make or break it with the click of a button, and they had no idea how fragile their system truly was. I wasn't the one scrambling in panic, they were. They would be the ones trying to figure out why everything had stopped, why their perfectly crafted world had ground to a halt. And when they realised it, when they understood that it was all because of me, they would have no choice but to listen. I could already feel the shift in the room, the tension building. I didn't need to rush. I didn't need to call attention to myself. I simply let the silence speak for itself. My fingers hovered over the controls, poised to bring the systems back online when the time was right. It wasn't about showing them I could fix the problem. It was about showing them that I was the one who created the problem in the first place. They had never understood the extent of my knowledge, the depth of my expertise. They had dismissed me, overlooked me, only to realise now how crucial I was to the company's success. Their arrogance had blinded them to the truth, and now they would face the consequences. The seconds felt like hours as I stood there, watching the clock tick away, listening to the soft murmurs of confusion starting to ripple through the office. I knew the team was already scrambling, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. They had no idea that I was the one behind it, that I had orchestrated this moment with the quiet precision that had always been my strength. They were going to have to come to me. They would have no choice but to ask for my help, to beg for the very thing they had taken for granted. I wasn't going to make them wait long, but I was going to let them sweat it out. It wasn't cruel. It was just the way the world worked. When you underestimated someone, when you treated them like they were invisible, eventually they would make you notice. And that moment had arrived. I could already hear footsteps in the hallway, the sound of people rushing to the server room, the panic beginning to seep into the voices that echoed through the office. But I didn't move. I stood where I was, calm and controlled, as they rushed around in confusion. Let them come to me. Let them realise that they had no power without me. It was time to show them that I was the one in control. The server would be brought back online when I was ready, not a moment before. I didn't need to fix it right away. I didn't need to rush. This wasn't just about restoring order. It was about making them understand who held the cards. It was about proving, without a single word, that I had always been the one running the show. The truth was, they had always relied on me, but they had never acknowledged it. They had never bothered to understand what I did, what I brought to the table. Now they would. They would finally see. I heard the door to the server room open, the sound of frantic voices calling out to each other as they tried to figure out what had gone wrong. The urgency in their voices was palpable, but they were too late. The moment had passed. It was my turn now. I could hear them talking, but I didn't respond. I didn't need to. They had no idea that I was the one who had controlled their fate this whole time. As they continued to scramble, I calmly walked toward my desk, picked up my phone, and watched, as they slowly began to realise that nothing would happen without my say-so. They were desperate. They were scared. But most of all, they were aware of something they had never understood before. They needed me. Without me, everything stopped. And it would stay that way until I decided otherwise. The hum of the office was gone. The usual buzz of keyboards and ringing phones had been replaced by the unsettling silence that permeated the building. I could feel the tension rising, the nervous energy flowing through the halls. I sat at my desk, hands folded in front of me, watching the chaos unfold on the other side of the room. They had tried everything, restarting the server, checking the connections, calling tech support. But nothing had worked. They had no idea what had really happened, but I knew they would soon find out. The footsteps in the hallway grew louder as they gathered in the conference room, their voices rising in urgency. I could almost hear their frustration as they scrambled to make sense of the situation. They didn't know where to turn, didn't know that I held the key to fixing everything. They were too used to being in control, to calling the shots, to realizing that the very system they depended on could come to a halt in an instant. The moment stretched on, the seconds ticking by slowly as they continued to search for answers. It wasn't just the system that was down, it was their perception of reality, their understanding of power, of control. It was all falling apart, and they had no idea how to fix it. They had underestimated me, and now they were paying the price. As I sat there, watching the flurry of activity through the glass walls of the conference room, a calm sense of satisfaction washed over me. They thought I was the one at their mercy. But now it was clear who had the power. Slowly, I stood up from my desk, adjusting the hem of my blazer. I didn't hurry. There was no need. I wasn't running. I was simply walking into the room, ready to reclaim what was rightfully mine. As I crossed the floor, I could hear their voices quieting, the room falling into an expectant hush as they saw me approach. Their eyes shifted from the screens to the phone calls, to me. There it was again. Recognition. They hadn't expected me to walk back in, hadn't realized that I was the one who had the control. But I wasn't here to gloat. I wasn't here to rub their faces in the mess they had made. I was here to show them something more important. That their assumption about me, their judgment of me based on my appearance, had been wrong from the start. I stepped into the conference room, standing tall, my gaze meeting theirs. I didn't need to say anything. The moment I walked through that door, they understood. The power had shifted. I had always been the one in control. All it had taken was one small action, one simple decision to make everything stop. And now, as I stood before them, I could see the uncertainty in their eyes. They were realizing it. They had been wrong. They had underestimated me, misjudged me based on nothing more than the way I looked. They had been so focused on the surface, on appearances, that they had never truly seen who I was, what I was capable of. I stood there, letting the silence stretch just long enough for them to feel the weight of their mistake. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniable. And then, when the moment felt right, I spoke. I didn't shout. I didn't demand attention. My voice was calm, steady, and when I spoke, they listened. I told them that the server would be back online in minutes, but that they needed to understand something. This wasn't about the technology, it wasn't about the systems. This was about respect. This was about recognizing my worth, my contribution, not just my appearance. I wasn't just a body in a meeting room. I was the person who made things happen when no one else could. And when I finished speaking, I could see it, the shift. They were finally seeing me for who I really was. Not just the woman with the birthmark, not just the one they had brushed off, but someone who had the power to make everything stop and then restart it with a single decision. As the system came back online, I could feel their eyes on me, watching, calculating, trying to understand just what had just happened. But it didn't matter anymore. I had made my point. I had reminded them that their judgments were irrelevant. I had shown them that I was in control, and from now on I wouldn't let them forget it. The server was running again, the system restored, but the shift in power was irreversible. They could never look at me the same way again. The room had changed, and with it, everything had shifted. And as I walked out of the conference room, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Not because I had won, but because I had finally made them see the truth. They had never really seen me before. But now they would, and they would never forget who I was again. I could feel their eyes on me, heavy with the weight of realization. The room was thick with a quiet tension, the sound of footsteps and muted conversations fading into the background as I made my way to the centre. The executives who had dismissed me, the ones who had judged me based on nothing more than the surface, were now staring at me as if they had just woken up from a dream they didn't understand. I had never been one to demand attention, but in this moment it was impossible for them to ignore me. The truth was undeniable, and it had settled in the air like a cloud. The power had shifted, and I had been the one to make it happen. They had underestimated me. They had looked at me as though I was just another woman with an unusual appearance, someone they could push aside because I didn't fit their narrow idea of what power should look like. But now, they were seeing the truth. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't weak. I had always been here, quietly making decisions that no one else had the skill to handle. It wasn't the big, flashy moments that mattered. It was the quiet work, the work that built everything they depended on without them even knowing. The power that flowed through me was quiet but strong, and I had used it to make them realize that they could never succeed without me. They hadn't understood it before, but now, in the silence of the room, they knew. I had always been in control. I had always held the key to their success, even when they couldn't see it. They had no choice but to look at me now, to acknowledge the truth. They had so carelessly overlooked. I didn't need to prove myself anymore. They knew the truth now. As I stood there, I let the silence hang in the air for a moment longer. I didn't need to say anything. My actions had already spoken louder than words ever could. The server was back online, the systems running again, but it was clear that the real shift wasn't in the technology. It was in how they saw me. The once dismissed woman, the one they thought wasn't fit for their world, had just turned everything on its head. I wasn't the one scrambling anymore. They were. The tension in the room was palpable as they began to shift in their seats, their discomfort now evident. I could see the realization dawning on their faces, the begrudging respect in their eyes. They were no longer looking at me as the unusual woman they had thought was a liability. They were looking at me as someone who had just proven her worth, not through loud speeches or grand gestures, but through the quiet, undeniable truth of what I could do when they underestimated me. It was almost surreal, watching them scramble, trying to salvage their dignity, while silently acknowledging what had just happened. They had wanted to push me aside, to pretend that I didn't matter, but now they had to face the fact that I was the one who had the power to bring everything to a halt, and the power to make it work again. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to rub their faces in it. I didn't need to say a word. They knew. They knew that I had been the one making everything happen from behind the scenes, and they knew that they had no choice but to recognize it now. As the last few murmurs of disbelief died down, I straightened up, ready to leave. I didn't need to stay here any longer. I had made my point. I had shown them that they couldn't afford to ignore me anymore. I wasn't the woman they thought. I was. I wasn't just the one with the unusual appearance. I was the one who had earned my place, who had worked quietly, tirelessly, to make everything work, even when no one else saw it. They could deny it all they wanted, but the truth was already out there. And now, as I left the room, I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. Not because I had won, not because I had proven anything, but because they had finally seen me. They had finally seen my worth, and that was all that mattered. As I walked down the hallway, I could hear the quiet conversations beginning to stir, the shift in their voices as they processed everything that had just happened. They wouldn't forget this. They wouldn't forget me. And when the dust settled, they would know that I had always been in control. I had always been the one who held the power, and they had been wrong to dismiss me.